back. It's September, and it's September 20th, and I was just thinking only 3 more months and the year is done. I hope all of you had a wonderful summer and had some time off during the summer break as well. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Amrin Najib. I'm the Vice Chair, Culture and Inclusion for the Department of Medicine. We welcome you back for the Department of Medicine citywide grand medical rounds. And today, on behalf of Culture and Inclusion, it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker, which I'll do very shortly. I think Christian and Ramona has the slides, which we are very cognizant of what to do while we are attending Zoom rounds. We have been practicing for the last 3 years. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we always begin these rounds with the land acknowledgement. So we would like to begin with a land acknowledgement on which we work, study, and live. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the land upon which the work of University of Toronto Department of Medicine is conducted. We acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. Today, this land is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, work, and gather on these territories. I always say that land acknowledgement are a starting point for a larger conversation. It's September. September 30th is the Orange Shirt Day. And I'm thinking myself and reflecting, how can I be part of this reconciliation process? Because it's not just about the orange color or by wearing an orange shirt, it's about reflecting how can we individually and collectively as Department of Medicine, as Canadian, whether by birth or by adopting this country by immigration, can be part of this reconciliation process and to commemorate the survivors of the residential schools of Canada. So more concrete acts of restitution and transformation are needed to address the underlying inequities and blatant discrimination in the distribution of resources between Canada's First People and settlers. So Ramona, we can stop sharing the screen. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker today. It's such an impressive bio that I think I can do a whole rounds on by just reading the bio as well. I've been given permission to share the highlights. So Dr. Julie Silver, who is an associate professor and associate chair in the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at Harvard Medical School. She directs the Harvard Medical School CME accredited course called Career Advancement and Leadership for Women in Healthcare that has trained thousands of physicians and healthcare leaders throughout the United States and also internationally. Her research and clinical work is focused on improving gaps in the diversity of healthcare services, and she has published an enormous amount of work on workforce diversity, equity, and inclusion, and is currently serving as a subject matter expert for the ACGME initiative Equity Matters. She is a recognized expert on best practices in mentorship and sponsorship, and some of her recent work has focused on faculty retention and belonging. So it's my absolute pleasure. She's a well-published author. She's a well-sought keynote speaker. So it's my absolute pleasure to have Dr. Silver here today for the Department of Medicine Citywide Medical Grant Rounds. Stage is yours, Julie.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and to see colleagues who I worked with before. Thank you so much for the lovely opportunity. I decided to break this talk down into 3 different areas. The first part of the talk is going to be at an organizational level, sort of big picture, what can organizations do? Then we're going to narrow it down into what departments or divisions can do. And then we'll narrow it even further into what individuals such as yourselves can do. Importantly, this study came out in 2020. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it said that it showed that over a 35-year period, women physicians in academic medical centers were less likely than men to be promoted to the rank of associate or full professor or to be appointed to department chair. And this is the important part. There was no apparent narrowing in the gap over time. Now just think that through a little bit. For 35 years, the efforts that we made for gender equity did not result in a narrowing in the gap over time. Imagine if there was a treatment, let's say a vaccine or a treatment for diabetes, and we said that for 35 years it has been proven that it hasn't worked. Would we still be doing it? So we have to be thinking differently. And that's really what this talk is about today. It's about how to think differently. Now, the things that we've done in the past were likely necessary, but have not been sufficient. And I often preface my talks with this statement. This talk is for people that believe in science. If you don't believe in science, this talk is not for you. This talk is for people that believe in the evidence base and believe in science. We also want to be thinking about what is the intersection of workforce disparities with patient care disparities. I often think of them in two different buckets, but really there's probably some intersection there, and it hasn't been well studied, as this review that I co-authored with colleagues shows. I'm going to touch briefly on some intersectional identities, especially as they relate to underrepresented individuals, but I want to be clear that the most of the research has been done just looking at gender in a binary way. So since I'm presenting an evidence-based talk, I have to kind of go where the literature leads us. So let's talk organizational level. Usually there's three arguments that you can sort of drive change with. The first one is this is better for patient care. One of the concerns I have with that argument is that I'm not convinced that women are better than men or men are better than women, or I think that there's nuances maybe we bring to things, and there are some studies that suggest, for example, women physicians might pay more attention to women's cardiac symptoms in the emergency department or whatever. But I'm not totally convinced that that this is the right path. And we don't have a huge body of evidence to suggest that it is either. The second one is the ethical argument. It's the right thing to do. Be inclusive. Of course, that's true. I assume everyone on this talk would agree with that. But again, this argument hasn't really changed things enough. So I tend to focus on argument number 3, which is the financial. So you're going to see a lot of financials woven into this talk. I made this picture of me, and it's supposed to represent me. I made it with AI, and it took me about 60 seconds. If you're not using the AI images, they're really fun to put into slides. I'm going to show you some other images I made. This is an oil painting, modern physician, of a woman pointing her finger and tipping over a building. That's how fast I put it into AI, created the image. My work is really focused on tipping points. This is literally me figuring out where the tipping points is. This is the hardest part of my work, is figuring out how not to take on the entire thing and just spin my wheels, but to find the really key places where we can drive change. So this talk is really about tipping points. Clinical practice guidelines is one tipping point. Clinical practice guidelines are created usually by medical societies that convene the panel, the authors, and then a journal that's affiliated with that society usually publishes it. And then they're distributed throughout the world. And especially if they're produced in the United States or Canada, North America, they're distributed everywhere. And this truly influences billions of dollars that go from one place to another, or not. So access to care, treatment, et cetera, are highly, highly influenced with clinical practice guidelines. Again, this is a tipping point. And we know from a study that came out in 2018, about 5 years ago, people really started to get interested in this issue. And they said, wow, women are not equitably included on clinical practice guidelines, really in almost every specialty, and especially women physicians. It gets even lower when you look at men physicians versus women physicians. Women physicians are particularly underrepresented. And a study that just came out looked at race and ethnicity. And what you'll see here, these are non-racialized women, i.e. white women. And these are racialized women, i.e. BIPOC women, women of color. So you can see that women of color are not contributing very much to clinical practice guidelines, nor are women in general. And you can also see from the study that I did with colleagues in neurology that it's not equal all across even a specialty, that you may have some parts of a specialty that are more equitable than other parts of a specialty. So in this report, I was invited by the journal Cell to write a perspective, a commentary article that would really push the agenda, the gender equity agenda. And they said, look, we know things are not going the way they should be going. We see that. And we really want to push the boundaries, but we want to do it in a way that's sophisticated and ethical and all of that. And so I came up with this concept called interorganizational structural discrimination. And I decided the reason I came up with this is I really got the idea from fair trade. So keep in mind that fair trade is a social movement in which buyers will not give growers money for their goods if the growers use forced labor, i.e. slave labor, child labor, or they don't pay their workers fairly. So I said, all right, this idea of just self-governance is exactly what fair trade is not about. Fair trade is saying, you haven't governed yourselves well, buyers, or growers rather. You haven't governed yourselves well, and so we're not giving you money. We're not going to be complicit. So I basically said, look, these individual organizations have not governed themselves well. And so now they're complicit in these relationships that support structural sexism, structural racism, etc. So we gave it 3 features. And in this report, I invited I think there's 19 different co-authors. One of them is Dr. Lorello, who's at the meeting here today, who contributed and really helped make this paper much better with his keen insights. And what we did is we said that these are organizations that work together voluntarily. One has a structural discrimination issue, and that is known to be fixable. And clinical practice guidelines is clearly one of those. And so here we have an example from the North American Spine Society. And what they did was they basically left out, almost all of the women experts. In fact, there are only 3 out of 49 people, 3 women out of 49. And then all of these medical societies decided to endorse it, even though it says this does not necessarily imply endorsement. That's not true. Of course, it implies endorsement. They had the opportunity to say, no, we're not endorsing this. You basically excluded women. So there's other ways to do it. This is an example that I worked on with colleagues. There are many examples where you can be inclusive. We have many brilliant minds who happen to be from underrepresented groups. And when you see a group that looks pretty much the same, you can speak up and make sure that there is an equitable proportion of people who are underrepresented. And clinical practice guidelines is one example. Again, it's a tipping point. Recognition awards is another tipping point. And a lot of my work has been focused on medical societies because the finances go the opposite way. And again, remember when I said that the argument about the financial argument is really very strong. We pay medical societies, professional societies to represent us. And when we get grants or when we get money from our employer, that goes into our bank account. When we go to professional societies, the money comes out of our bank account. And the same is true for departments and divisions that cover professional fees and things. We pay money as employers, we pay money out of our coffers to medical societies for equitable representation. So recognition awards was a tipping point. I didn't aspire to be a recognition award researcher. That was not my goal. My goal was to show show through recognition awards that medical societies were not equitably representing people. And so this is one medical society, and for the previous 4 years, they had 0 women physicians. 0. Imagine thousands of people in the room, and I was in the room, frankly. Imagine thousands of people in the room and not saying anything as man after man after man gets award, and every single brilliant woman is ignored. Wow. So in this paper, we came up with this concept that the US courts use called inexorable zero. Inexorable zero is a true zero or near zero number or proportion. And what happens when you see a near zero or true zero number and an inexorable zero is the courts say on its face, a prima facie inference, on its face, we conclude that there's discrimination here at play. It just doesn't make sense. And when we look at causality, just because you find a disparity doesn't mean you know causality. When you look at causality, it's almost always multifactorial. In this case, it was multifactorial. And two of the things that we found is number one, that for mid-career, no women were nominated. So we knew it was a nomination issue, at least partly a nomination issue. But in the early career category, we had women nominated who were extremely talented and really deserving, and they never made it out of committee. So we tackled this problem two different ways. For mid-career women, we really encouraged nominations. And for early career women, we gave the awards committee implicit bias training and showed them their numbers. So again, I didn't want to be a recognition awards researcher. So I started just going after inexorable zeros to show this isn't just one specialty society. This is lots of specialty societies that have these zeros or near zeros, these inexorable zeros. And I recently published this paper with colleagues in the British Medical Journal on the Lasker Award. So it's not just medical societies, it's also very prestigious groups. The Lasker Award is incredibly prestigious, often leads to the Nobel Prize. And can you imagine not having any change over 3/4 of a century? I mean, it doesn't even make sense. And by the way, the Lasker Foundation has a lot of content and has been very vocal with diversity, et cetera. And so their words do not match their actions. So just as something I hope that we can all agree on, for any award in medicine, there are more than 0 women who deserve it. So recognition awards, some action steps, be sure there's a match with organizational statements. And that when you have DEI and you're saying you're supporting it, that your numbers match up with those statements, and measure your outcomes. Make sure that you're really looking at things. So we talked about clinical practice guidelines, and we talked about recognition awards. Third tipping point here, journal editors. This is one of the most interesting problems. And it is the only one that I can find, and I have searched high and low, the only one that I can find that has documentation in the evidence base for more than 20 years of a problem that is known to be fixable, easy to fix, and doesn't cost any money to fix. So if there's any evidence of a lack of a will to change, it's this problem. So as we look at editors, let's talk about this a little bit. First of all, many medical societies own journals or they're affiliated with journals. And this really fits into that interorganizational structural discrimination issue. If a medical society owns a journal or is affiliated with a journal, then it should insist that its journal have an equitable proportion of women as editors. And the CWMGR has codified owner obligations, i.e. the medical societies have owner obligations to ensure editors act in a manner that is compatible with a position of trust. This doesn't mean the medical society decides what content goes in there in the journal. There are firewalls for that sort of thing, but we're not talking about content. We're talking about equity on the editorial boards. Now, I was giving a talk in the United States to a group of women deans, and one of the deans said, let's just publish the names of the journals and the editors in the New York Times who are not equitable. And I thought, oh boy, that's not really my style. I don't want to shame individuals per se. I'd rather publish studies and advocate and so on. But interestingly, one of the journal editors got himself into the New York Times by behavior that was that had serious issues, and just the structural racism and structural sexism that was underlying this. It wasn't one racist podcast, which is kind of what blew everything up. It was everything else that came before it with the structural sexism, the structural racism, and so on. And you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, this is a study that was published in Health Affairs, that these journals, these really big journals, most of which are in the United States, weren't covering the topic of racism. Again, some overlap here maybe between workforce disparities and patient care disparities. So this has become a really big deal. And to kind of highlight this, it's very, very interesting. We look at the specialty of pediatrics because there's more women than men in pediatrics. So if any specialty could really hit it out of the park and be fair, it would be pediatrics. And yet, pediatrics has been called out time and time and time again for its journals not equitably including women editors. And we just published this study, and we looked at the editors, and we looked at two benchmarks: parity, 50-50, and equity, which is well over the 50% mark. And two of the journals that we studied three journals: the Journal of Pediatrics, and then JAMA Pediatrics, the three highest impact journals. Two of those journals, despite being called out in multiple papers, continue to have the inclusion of women physicians below both benchmarks. Below both benchmarks. Think that through. This is an easy problem to solve. It's been in the literature for more than 20 years, and this is at least the fifth or sixth paper that was published on the same exact topic. So you might be thinking, what is it going to take to get people to change? Well, we started thinking about it. Why is this such an intractable issue? Why are editors hanging on so strong? Why are they not including women? And one of the things we were wondering, again, thinking about money, is there something financial going on? What is happening here? So we looked at the literature, and sure enough, there are some studies that show that journal editors receive industry-associated payments. In the United States, there's something called the Sunshine Law, which means that industry has to report when physicians get money. So you can go to a website and you can look it up. And we looked at the total payments to editors of pathology and hematology oncology journals. All right. So just for fun, and you can put it in the chat, just for fun, what do you think the total payments to the top woman editor who got the most payments and the top man editor were? Just for fun, go ahead and put it in the chat. Let's see what you think. Top woman versus top man. All right, let's go in millions, people. Keep going. Two times the difference. Okay. When I showed this in the next slide at NIH, when I did this, the folks at NIH were blown away. They were like, what? All right. Top woman got 2 million. Top man got almost 48 million. $48 million. And they invited the former editor-in-chief of JAMA, Dr. Lundberg, to write an editorial that went with our paper. And his first line is, "Was there a quid pro quo? I do not know, but I am worried." How many of you are concerned about an editor-in-chief who gets $48 million in industry payments, and you have a paper that disagrees with some of his research? Wow. All right. So we know that editors can change this because they've published on it. They've published how they've changed their editorial boards, etc. And here's some action steps. hold journals accountable. Again, this is an example of interorganizational structural discrimination. Now I'm going to go from the big picture of organizations and the tipping points down to department and division level types of things. We just published this paper looking at 5 different things that chairs of departments, division chiefs, etc., can do. And these are really straightforward things that people can do. They're actionable. And part of the reason that I did this is as when I go and I'm a visiting professor at different places, people kept saying, well, can you give us strategies, like actionable strategies? What else can we do? And so on. So this is a really good paper for that. There's a lot of metrics. We've published on the metrics previously, and you can see these different types of things. Some of the things that are more subtle, like sundry fund payments, speaker payments, and again, tie it to the money. So always look at when people ask me how much I want to be paid to give a talk, what I tell them back is please check your records and pay me at least as much or more than all of the previous speakers who are doing a similar type of talk. Remember when I started this, I put the Richter et al. Paper up and I said, in 35 years, things haven't changed. Well, this is the criteria for promotion at Harvard Medical School. And this looks very much like the promotion criteria at other places. And look at these different things. These are the tipping points where we don't have equity. So as women go up for these promotions, you can see that they, when there's disparities at every single criteria or nearly every criteria, and these are just the tipping points when I actually show the criteria and I show my research, because I've tackled almost every line on this and more. When I show that, usually the only thing that's not part of a medical society, et cetera, is service as a consultant on issues related to clinical expertise. Everything else relates to medical societies and or journals. Also, there's subtle things. There's subtle asks. There's subtle things that people are encouraged to do. And these things often are not going to facilitate promotions, et cetera, but really are things that drag women or people who are from underrepresented racial or ethnic groups or LGBTQ plus, et cetera, and they feel like they're kind of voluntold that they have to do these things. This is about mentorship and sponsorship. So as I looked at the Richter et al. Study and as I thought about sponsorship was really brought in from the business world. And it was never adapted for academic medicine or for medicine in general. It was never adapted for that. It was brought in from the business world. And what a lot of the articles and so on talk about is they say you find somebody that's more senior who believes in you. They start to advocate for you based on your potential, not on your actual accomplishments, which we can't advocate for people to get promoted to full professor based on potential. That is unethical. It doesn't happen. You have to get promoted based on your real accomplishments. And so there's like this disconnect with how sponsorship has been brought into our world where there's some problems ethically and so on. And also, a lot of men would say, I have been mentioning somebody when they're not in the room. I have been advocating for them and they weren't getting credit. Again, deans and chairs also were not getting credit for not promoting. They were getting too much credit or too much blame for not promoting their women faculty, et cetera. And really it was a part of it was a snafu with the medical societies. So a lot of my work really is focused on trying to be fair and saying, hey, I think a lot more men are stepping up than we're giving them credit for. I think a lot more chairs and deans are doing things, but they're getting stymied by medical societies and journals. And I think that a lot more men are involved in trying to sponsor women, but they're not sponsoring them for the things that are really helping with their CVs. And so this is an example of a sponsorship party. It's a lot of fun. I run this regularly with different groups that I work with. And the person who needs sponsorship gets 2 minutes to present her slide. We often do this virtually. We also can do it in person. The party guests are all potential sponsors, and they have 3 minutes after she presents to write her an email and say how they can help with sponsorship. And this is an example of a slide. This is one of my mentees, and you can just see how easy it is to make this slide and tailor it to her individual asks and so on. I'm having a sponsorship party next Tuesday, and it'll be a lot of fun, and do this regularly. Now let's, again, narrow even further down to the individual level. And critical mass theory said, look, when we have about 30% women or so, things will change on their own. We know that hasn't worked. Again, this is a talk for people that believe in science, all right? Critical mass theory has not worked. If you believe in science, you know that, because pediatrics is a great case example, but there's tons of examples that show that it hasn't worked. So I often say this is really critical actor training. This is just how do you become a critical actor and how do you drive change? And this is a great example of two of your colleagues who became critical actors, and on their own, they just said, you know what? We see these studies coming out of the United States. We think that we can replicate those studies in Canada. No one told them you have to do this. No one said we need you to do this. They just said, we're doing it. We are critical actors. We are empowered. We're going to figure this out. We're going to step up, and began to publish, and they've published a lot of terrific work. This is another paper that I just came out with on this idea of push-pull mentoring. What happens to a lot of women mid-career is they are expected to mentor and sponsor so many individuals that it slows them down, that they don't get the support that they need. So one way to overcome that, or at least to help with that, is for people to recognize that mid-career women need to be pushed up even by the people they mentor. And there's a lot of opportunities that our mentees can provide for us as we mentor them. In the past, mentorship was supposed to be completely altruistic. You're not supposed to expect anything. Don't make it transactional or anything. But that doesn't really work in the real world, where mid-career women get stuck and they don't get promoted, and there's high rates of burnout, and there's all these early career folks and trainees that really, really need mentoring. So in the real world in which we all live, we've got to figure out new strategies and new ways of doing things. This is my speed mentoring. A big report came out right before the pandemic from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, Medicine, NASEM, and they talked about how you have to have different types of mentoring, and speed mentoring is something I do a lot of. I can spend 30 minutes with somebody and I can make a huge difference in their career. I'll just give you an example. We get new faculty in, and I will spend 30 minutes. Each one of these little circle boxes, whatever, are 5 minutes. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, welcome to the department. We are so glad that you accepted a position here. We really are excited to have you here. And this is what our department is doing. We are the Department of PM&R at Harvard Medical School. We are one of the leading resources for rehabilitation medicine. Our department publishes about one new paper every single day. And we're just really thrilled to have you here. 5 minutes of, happy to have you here, and here's our department value. Next 5 minutes, what are your goals? What do you want to accomplish in the next couple of years? And, how can we help? Third little one, specific things. Oh, you want to do such and such? I know so-and-so. I can connect you. I'm going to email so-and-so. Oh, you want to publish on this? I'm going to invite you to be a co-author on a paper I'm working on. Oh, you want this? Next one, faculty promotion. I'm going to take them on the faculty promotion website. I'm going to show it to them. I'm going to help them figure out which track. There's 3 tracks for us, which track they're on. Next one, I'm going to show them bibliometrics. I'm going to show them how we measure scholarly work and dissemination. I'm going to show them Web of Science. I'm going to show them Google Scholar. I'm going to show them NIH's iSight. And I'm going to tell them how Harvard Medical School measures academic scholarly success through research dissemination. And then finally, I'm going to close with really talking about belonging and value. I'm going to say, you belong here. We would not have hired you if you didn't belong here. You may feel at times like It's a little uncomfortable. You may get frustrated at times. Come back and talk to me. I can tell you, you belong here. We want you here. We want you to stay. Hope is not a strategy. You know, trying to commit your time and resources, et cetera, to make things, you know, be a better ally is important. On an individual level, the common thing is, I don't have time, I don't have time, I don't have time. That is absolutely true. Sometimes when I talk, people say, I have done every single thing to maximize my time. There is nothing left to do. I actually think there's always like ways you can maximize your, or, you know, get more time. I'm showing you one of them, create images out of AI, and you can use Bing to do that. Super easy. And so if you move closer to work or further from work, if you do the math over time, you will start to see those weeks add up. How many of you would like 90 weeks back in your schedule? 90 weeks if you saved that 60 minutes a day. There's a bunch of ways to do this. It's super fun. And I know everyone laughs at me because I estimated based on 40-hour work week. I know you all work more than 40 hours, but I'm just saying, do the math, do it over years. You can use those 90 weeks or those 30 weeks or those 8 weeks to spend more time with your kids. You can save it to exercise. You can save it to travel. You can do anything you want with it. It's really fun to save. A few things to remember. I think that it's important to focus on that you're not an imposter, that you are here for a reason, that you got through the training that you got, and the world can make you feel like it sometimes, but you're not an imposter. Imposter syndrome is really pathology, actually, and they've even talked about making it part of DSM criteria. Normal anxiety is when you're a little worried about giving a talk. I was a little worried about giving this talk. I was thinking, all right, I want to make sure that the Zoom works. I want to make sure my slides are up to date. I want to make sure whatever, but I'm not an imposter. And I've given this talk many different times in many different ways. And I know I can tell almost every question you're going to ask me, and I'm happy to take your questions, but I have been asked almost every question in the book. I know the questions that are coming, and I have answers for them. That's very different than if I said, oh my gosh, I can't sleep. I can't do this talk. You know, I don't know what to say or whatever. That's imposter syndrome. Even that imposter syndrome is when you really can't do something that, or you think you can't do it, but your evidence says that you've done it before. So I want to separate normal anxiety, which is you're not very familiar with something big's coming up, from imposter syndrome. You're not imposters. You're the real deal. I also want to share that women tend to work harder, and they physically work harder, and they have time poverty. And this has been shown in a number of different studies that look at surgical instruments and procedures and so on, where women are physically working harder. This is a slide that I've used to just talk about how easy it is to solve problems and how reluctant we are to solve them. So I was 18 years old and I was an engineering major. And I was in an introductory engineering class, and I can tell you we did problems like this, design thinking problems. The problem would go something like this. You know, you have bathrooms, people take different amounts of time to go to the bathroom based on biology and also some of their behaviors. And so how can we get everybody through in 2 minutes or less, or, you know, into a stall? So this is a super easy problem for an 18-year-old to solve. And yet we have queuing all over the world. Women have time poverty and they line up to go to the bathroom. Now, sometimes people tell me, ha, 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 I've been to a sports game and I had to wait too. I'm like, you know, that's not actually legit. Just because you've had an opportunity a few times in your life to stand in a line does not replicate the experience of women who stand in line constantly to go to the bathroom. If you don't believe you have privilege, just walk by a line like this and go into a men's bathroom. That is exactly what privilege looks like. So there's 2 ways we can fix this issue. We can fix the women, so we can make all women not menstruate. We can put all women in menopause. Everybody goes into menopause. We can tell women, don't take your kids to the bathroom, just keep them in diapers forever. That's not a really good solution. Or we can fix the structure, right? We can just fix the structure and do a simple design thinking problem that an 18-year-old can do in a beginning engineering class. This is another example where we have these moms who are lactating, and this specialty society decided to convene a group to try to get a lactation room. And the dean or chair should have called up and just said, hey, we're not sending any of our faculty across the gender spectrum unless there's lactation rooms for our lactating individuals. So solve the problem. Stop wasting women's time. It's pretty simple. Some of these problems are really that easy. Workforce equity really involves three things. You know, the triple aim, hopefully, from, quality initiatives and so on. But when it comes to workforce, it's really pay equity, promotion equity, and then harassment-free workplace with a good work-life balance. If you can do those three things simultaneously, that's great. If you do one of them or two of them, it's not enough. Have to do all three. So in this talk, gave you a bunch of new tools, some new definitions, told you about sponsorship parties, push-pull mentoring, speed mentoring, all these different things, and created a little toolkit that I'll leave you with and talk to you a bit about AI. Again, these almost all of these images were created via AI, and it took me about 30 seconds an image. And here's the toolkit that I made for you that you can download, and it has a lot more information. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank
Happy to take
you
questions.
so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Silver, for sharing your wisdom and for sharing your work with us and sharing the toolkit. I think we open the rounds to the audience. Any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask, or you can type in the chat. If you don't feel comfortable asking yourself, you can private message me and I can share your question as well. Yes, we have a hand. Hi.
Hi, thanks very much, Dr. Silver. I thought that was a very nice talk and really showcased a lot the diverse area of your research and your scholarship in this area. Was really nicely done. A question I have, and I was just wondering, I've spoken about it with some other people. In Canada, it's much more the culture to have term limits on leadership positions. And my surprise often is in a lot of the American institutions, particularly with medicine, but I think it's in other institutions, that there aren't really any attached term limits to either chairs or even it could be administrative chairs, it could be scientific chairs, and here we're I won't say wedded, but we're pretty strict and stringent, and it's become even more so with adhering to term limits for various positions, be it 5+5 or 7+7, but term limits. And to the extent that I remember hearing at some of the institutions that people are in positions for 30 years, 35 years, and I just, to me, that almost seems like a structural element that I looked at one of your, where you talked about structural elements to change. I think that's something that really, the idea about turnover in leadership can really help in a lot of different ways with equity. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that, or if that's been your experience.
That's a great question. So term limits is something that's been debated a lot. Mayo Clinic, for example, has term limits. And some other organizations do as well. But you're right, it is not common in the United States. And yes, people can hold the same position for many, many years. So one of the things that is really important before deciding whether it supports equity or not is to really look at the numbers and to see, because what happens anecdotally is that women will get to like a mid-career level, have a term limit, and that'll be their last promotion. And they have almost nothing else they can do. So a lot of women will go back to like full-time clinical. They'll be sort of booted out of leadership altogether because the leadership positions are not equitable. And so term limits work if there's equity at the higher levels, and really kind of looking at, again, identity characteristics such as race, ethnicity, intersectional identity characteristics, women who are from underrepresented racial or ethnic minority groups, LGBTQ, people with disabilities, those kinds of things. So the numbers tell the story, and I just think we shouldn't make assumptions about term limits and that they really promote equity until we actually look at the numbers. And there aren't really good studies on that I'm aware of. But it's a great question.
Louis Harris, then Stephen and Christine. There is a comment in the chat. If you can share the toolkit again, Julie. Yeah, go ahead, Louis.
So thank you for a very inspiring talk. I want to go back to a slide that you showed with the lactation room and the two different approaches. And I feel that often women don't feel empowered to set out their requests or their asks in a firm manner. So what was interesting about that slide was that people sat around debating, maybe perhaps could we ask for, and yet really the answer was it should just have been a straightforward request. And I would be interested in your opinion, because I often, having worked with a lot of younger women going forward on promotion, feel that people tend to underestimate the power of their own voice.
That's such a great question. There's actually a study that just came out. So I agree with you in sort of as a concept. Like, I do think that women should ask and should articulate and so on, but there's still a power imbalance, and that when they ask for things, they don't always get things. And I was literally just working on some slides that are another speaker is going to present at my women's leadership course. And there's a new study that just came out kind of debunking the book Women Don't Ask. So the book Women Don't Ask was published a number of years ago, and it really was about women not asking and therefore not getting. And this study is not, I don't think one study is generalizable to all things, but this study was basically saying when it came to pay gaps and things, that women asked more often than men and they got less than men. And so I do think that, power often is the thing that rules. But one thing I want to say, which I think is really helpful, is I know who my allies are, and they have identified themselves in a lot of different ways. And whenever I ask men to help with something, to support something, to do something, like 99.9% of the time they say yes. That's because I'm asking them for something specific, and I'm going to people that I know and trust and that are allies, and they say yes. They're really, really wonderful. So, I think, another thing too at getting at structural issues is no one should have to ask for a lactation room. It should just be done. It should be part of a checklist for a society, right? A medical society puts on a course, whatever, and it should be part of a checklist, and no one should have to do that asking. No one's time should be wasted on that. That should just be an automatic.
Stephen?
Yes, interesting. Interested in the Mayo Clinic comments, because I've been to the Mayo Clinic a couple of times and visited, and was quite struck by the policies there, which to me look very different from the average American hospital. In particular, if I recall correctly, all the physicians are on salaries, and there's a strict dress code. All the men are wearing ties. They have to, there's a dress code. I don't know if it affects women, but those things, which, they're quite powerful policies, which most hospitals would be afraid to impose on their staff. Do you think that made a difference in the ratio of men and women, that type of pay policy versus a pure pay for service policy?
Right. So the Mayo Clinic is different. And actually, the Mayo Clinic has published on its pay. And one study that they published, that people at Mayo Clinic published, found that there weren't really pay gaps, but there were promotion gaps. And that gets at the earlier question about term limits and just making assumptions that term limits work. If you look at that Mayo Clinic paper, I mean, it's not a direct look at term limits per se, but since Mayo Clinic does term limits, and since women are paid fairly at the level that they're at, but there's promotion gaps so they don't get promoted up, that's a problem. And that gets at the triple aim part of it.
Christine and Mona.
Yes. Oh, sorry. So I just want to say first, thank you for that excellent talk. It was really great, and I very much appreciated the toolkit and some of the tangible interventions. So I want to talk a bit about equitable scientific publishing. I'm currently an associate editor at a medical journal where we are trying to implement some ways of diversifying and making our practices more equitable and inclusive. But it's challenging because, you know, your concept, that term that you brought up, the time poverty issue for women in medicine, it's like a bit of a wicked problem, because at the same time, at many scientific journals, one outcome and measure of success is how quickly you turn around papers and publications and manuscripts. And as an editor, it's very challenging to get people to reply, one, to your peer review requests, and, you know, trying to diversify your peer review you know, requests to include many people of different areas and membership in different groups. This idea, like, how do we balance that, this need to sort of have very quick access and provide these opportunities, but at the same time recognizing that many folks from other groups, particularly women, have this problem with the time poverty issue. So just wondering about that.
So I have a great answer for that. And I've thought about this a lot. And I've written about this. You can look at sheleadshealthcare.com, and you can download the Her Time Is Now report. In this report, what I explained was this is the exact example of structural sexism, structural racism. Journals were formed a long time ago. They were formed and they have these, so structural racism and structural sexism by definition are policies, procedures, culture that predict a certain outcome. And that outcome, you know, results in disparities for people who are underrepresented, okay? So journals were developed a long time ago. The process for it was you volunteer usually as a reviewer, then you volunteer in low positions as assistant editor or whatever. And then as you get up, you get more into paid positions and such. Think about how that translates in a world where the journals were set up, it was mostly men, and they didn't have very much education debt. Now we take that same exact system and we apply it to, for example, BIPOC women who have high education debt, and they are not the editors in chiefs. And so if we say to them, oh, if you volunteer all this time and you do all of this, someday you'll be the editor in chief, we have zero evidence to suggest that they will be the editor in chief. In fact, we have a lot of evidence to say that they will never be the editor in chief and they will not be paid. And so we're telling them to buy into a system and volunteer their time in a system that doesn't pay them or promote them. And that is exactly what structural sexism and structural racism looks like. So the journals say, hey, we don't have enough money. We can't do that. So if you read the Her Time Is Now report, you will see that I looked at journals and their respective medical societies, and I looked up the 990 forms, which are the tax forms in the US, and I put how much money these folks were making, and I gave examples, specific examples. There's money in the system to pay people. And we shouldn't be expecting women and people from underrepresented groups who have huge education debt. And I know education debt is different in the US than it is in Canada. I know that, but huge education debt and pretending like they're going to be promoted at some point when all the evidence suggests that they won't.
Mona?
Thank you so much for that talk. It's something that I talk about a bit in my research environment. And so hearing how you put your talk together was really useful for me. One thing you didn't bring up until actually your last answer regarding structural sexism and structural racism is you didn't bring up what I talk about is the issue of patriarchy and misogyny in the academic environment. There's a great podcast called Breaking Down Patriarchy, where there's podcasts about patriarchy in the academic system and education system. There's many universities in the United States that didn't allow women to enroll until the 1970s. In Canada, there's only been 2 women university presidents out of the hundreds over years. Deans of universities, very few women. Chairs of departments, we have one, but very few women. You went over the editorial boards. Yes, we can do our presentations, but it just still doesn't change. I email in my field. I'm in HIV, so I did a presentation on patriarchy in my field and showed the International AIDS Society, 90% of the presidents are men. At the Canadian HIV Association, 85% of the presidents have been men. The speakers are 75 to 80% men. Most of the women are white, if there's any. I think it comes down to patriarchy and that there's a lot of change that needs to happen, and I like the sponsorship, your sponsorship parties, but I think it's just such a bigger issue to dismantle patriarchy in the academic system, and that more needs to be done.
So I agree with you that I do think that there's more that, and I hope no one takes away from this that I think sponsorship parties are the answer to all of these problems. We've driven, and if you download some of my papers and things, I think you'll see that I'm tackling things very systematically. I do want to clarify one thing. My entire talk was about patriarchy, and I showed example after example. I choose my language very carefully. And I choose my language very carefully because I want to bring along various audiences. I am never giving a talk like this for the people that already agree with me. That is not how change happens. Change happens if I convince some of the people who have not given this a lot of thought already, what we would call the early adopters, the early majority. If we can get the early majority on board, and this comes from sort of organizational change and how change has been studied. If you bring along the people that don't yet agree with you and what I call the reasonable people who need more information and data and so on, then that's how you can really drive change. It's hard to drive change with the people that will never agree with you. You can talk to you blue in the face and they'll never do it. So sometimes people will use the term charged language to identify terms that get people to feel defensive and worried. I usually do not use charged language in my lectures because I'm trying to bring people along. But make no mistake about it, that entire talk was about patriarchy.
Mm-hmm. I'm mindful of time. I'm seeing Geeta's hand as well. It's 12:59, and I know people have commitments, but thank you, Julie, for this, I would say, candid and provocative talk. I'm getting some private messages from many peers as well who shared some thoughts, but they didn't want me to ask that as a question. So I just am sharing that a lot of compliments are coming. I think you made us uncomfortable at moments, and that was intentional on your part. And I always remind myself, and maybe I'll take the liberty of reminding my peers, being uncomfortable is the first step of learning something new as well. So I'm mindful that people have to leave at 1 p.m. So if those who want to leave, if you are generous with your time and ask to answer Geeta's question, it's fine. But if you have to leave exactly at 1, Julie, that's fine as well. But I want to thank you on behalf of Department of Medicine and Culture and Inclusion portfolio as well.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Geeta, you want to ask your question? I think
Yeah,
Julie's...
sure. If Dr. Silver can stay on. Thanks, Umbrin. Dr. Silver, thank you so much for a great talk and for all of your advocacy and success in highlighting all of these issues. I had a question regarding gendered expectations for behavior, regarding assertiveness, agentic versus communal traits, and how you answer that question and how you give advice to people, because we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. If we behave like a woman in leadership, we may be criticized. If we behave like a man in leadership, we will be criticized.
That's a great comment. I think that we sort of tackle it in a couple different ways. The first one is to just identify it, make people aware. So that's part of the implicit bias. You know, what expectations do you have for the way that someone is speaking and so on, and having people gently call out or ask people if they make a comment like, don't you think she's really aggressive? You know, just gently say like, would you say that about a man? And you know, that's one way. So just to recognize it, call it out. The other way, the other thing that I think is important is to decide for yourself individually how you're going to live in the real world that exists. And I often say this to people. I'm like, you know, there's a lot of people that say, tear the whole system down, just tear it down, make it all different and all that. And it's like, that's not going to happen. And so there you are left in the real world that you have to function in. So how are you going to handle it? And I just encourage people to think for themselves how they want to handle it. How do they want to handle each situation? So for example, there was a book that's very popular called Lean In. And in my world, when people lean in, they get beat up a lot. And if you lean in all the time, you get beat up a whole lot. So one of the things that I recommend at my women's leadership course is I say, you always have 3 choices. You can lean in, you can lean around and up, or you can just sit tight and wait and see what happens. You don't have to do anything. Different situations, you know, you want to apply different strategies, but also you want to decide for yourself how much you want to lean in or not. There's many times I've leaned around and up. I've just said, okay, you told me no, I can figure out how to do this a different way or whatever. That line though of you know, people being labeled, you know, that really like you know, you're not good enough, you're too good, you're not loud enough, you're too loud. I mean, it's a narrow line, and that is life, unfortunately.
Thank you. And about the lean in, that also implies that it's up to women to fix the system as opposed to approaching the systemic deficits. Thank you so much.
Right, exactly. And part of approaching the systemic deficits is the education part of things, right? Not just educating women, but educating everyone about how they see women. I think one of the really interesting studies that was done on this, which I loved, is a study that was done looking at women professors. So if you go to ratemyprofessor.com, there's a website that gathers all of those professor ratings, and you put in a word like intelligent, and you'll see men are outrank women. This is millions of college students across the United States ranking their professors. And if you put in disorganized, it'll be women greater than men. So every positive term, you're going to see men more than women. Every negative term, you're going to see women more than men, pretty much. It's fascinating. So this starts way before, and this is women rating women too. So at the University of Iowa, I believe, there was a small study that was done. And what they did is they put a little, you know, anti-racism statement and you know, just said women and people from underrepresented racial and minority groups often get rated lower than men do. Please base the professor's rating on how that person actually taught rather than their personal characteristics. and the women's ratings went up. It said they had a control group, and it was really super simple, but it's a really elegant study, and I love it.
Mhm.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I know, Julie, we are encroaching on your time, but Esther has her hand, and I just wanted to add a comment around what Geeta is saying. And there are certain expectations around, for example, as a one brown woman to another brown woman, I think Geeta will agree with me. We are supposed to behave in a certain manner. And we South Asian people are very model minority. So I think at times as a woman of color, I struggle around this leadership, how to be a leader, how to be assertive or not to be assertive, and how will it be interpreted. Just sharing from that perspective. But I think your strategies which you shared were good. Esther?
Dr. Silver, I just want to say thank you. And also, honestly, in the front lines, this type of talk and this type of evidence is life-saving and kind of urgent for some of us. And I think it's so important to be collaborative and hear what others are doing. I have a comment and a question. The first is the patriarchy comment. I think it's actually beyond patriarchy. I think it's an issue of hierarchy. And I think if we just focus on the binary sense of what we've known, we actually lose out on supporting the next generation of research, which is non-binary discrimination. So I'm going to challenge your work and the work of others, is that I think we have to look at not patriarchy, but hierarchy, because as women become into leadership roles, we can have the opportunity to change that narrative or perpetuate that hierarchy. So then my question to you is, there is toxic behavior, and it's not just women against men or men against women, but sometimes it's other women against other women. How have you managed that, or what do you advise women who are experiencing this level of discrimination, not against from their male colleagues, but against from other women?
I get that question a lot too. And I think, the way I like to handle it is not to label women as being mean to women, because that feeds into a stereotype that sort of goes like this. Even women can't get along with women. Even other women don't like so-and-so. So I think that label we have to be really careful of. Women were trained just like men, and people all across the gender spectrum were trained in the same way to really value men and their opinions and so on. And that's where the Rate My Professors really comes in. You see it so clearly. It's like so clearly women are not supporting women professors either, and millions of ratings. So how do you combat that? Well, one is to have conversations like we're having here and really recognize that. Number two is to think through and just think, well, are sometimes women not supporting other women because they feel so vulnerable in their positions? So anecdotally, we have some data that suggests it takes longer for a woman to get a leadership position. She holds it less time than male colleagues hold it. And when she's released for whatever reason, she has a harder time finding another position. So that puts women in a really vulnerable position. And a lot of times women get sort of blamed, if you will, for not supporting other women when they're in a leadership position, but really they're really vulnerable. I do think that there is some toxicity that needs to be dealt with, some incivility and so on. I think conversations about that are really important. One thing that I talk about a lot is amplification. So if a woman, so amplifying other women is really important, but the amplification also works if someone says, well, gee, even Julie Silver doesn't like her. Like even Julie Silver doesn't like, whoa. Like, that is such powerful amplification. So I personally try to really temper what I say and give grace to other women, other women in general, and certainly grace to women who have intersectional identities with other underrepresented groups. I really try to give grace and not be overly critical. And conversations like this help to I think, help with that kind of a culture or perspective or whatever.
Guys, we are at 1:10. Let's conclude the rounds. We have went over time. So thank you everybody for staying late, and thank you, Dr. Silver. I was wondering the toolkit which you shared, if you can provide an email. I know we have recorded the presentation, but in case somebody asks for those e-resources, we can share that as well.
Sure, happy to send you those.
And Gianni, I was wondering if you can share your Canadian work. Maybe I can share it to the Department of Medicine. This is Canadian data, because sometimes we Canadians have this mentality that we are better than the south of the border. I know things are not hunky-dory here as well. So if you don't mind sharing, we can share it with our Department of Medicine faculty as well.
Sounds good.
Okay, thanks everybody. Have a good day.
Nice seeing you again, Dr. Silver.
Thank you.
Bye
Thanks
now.
so much.